The Golden City Concert Hall was the kind of place where people didn't just go to hear music. They went to be seen. It was a massive building made of stone and glass, sitting right in the middle of the busy city like a king sitting on a throne. Inside, the air always smelled expensive, like old wood, perfume, and flowers that had been cut just an hour ago. There were golden railings, red velvet curtains that felt thicker than a winter coat, and thousands of bright lights hanging from the ceiling like chandeliers. But for every person who sat in the soft velvet seats wearing expensive jewelry and tailored suits, there were 10 people working behind the scenes to make it all happen. One of those workers was an older man named Elias. Elias wasn't a musician. He wasn't a conductor, and he certainly wasn't a wealthy donor. He was the night cleaner. He was the kind of person that most people looked right through as if he were part of the wall or a piece of furniture. He was in his late 60s, with hair that had turned the color of iron and a face that was mapped with deep lines from years of smiling in the sun and frowning in the cold. He wore a dark blue uniform that was a little loose around his waist and heavy work boots that made a squeaking sound every time he took a step on the polished floors. It was a Tuesday night, late in the autumn. The big show of the evening had finished 2 hours ago. The famous pianist had taken his bow. The crowd had clapped until their hands hurt. Then everyone had gone home to their fancy apartments. Now, the building was quiet. The only sounds were the hum of the air conditioning and the distant traffic noise from the street outside. Elias pushed his heavy yellow cleaning cart down the center aisle. The cart was his partner. It held his mop, his broom, his trash bags, and a bottle of lemon-scented cleaner. He moved slowly, not because he was lazy, but because he liked to be careful. He didn't just clean the hall. He took care of it. He picked up the programs that people had dropped on the floor. He picked up a lost glove here, a crumpled tissue there. He treated the wooden armrests gently. Wiping away the dust with a soft cloth, he reached the front of the hall, right near the stage. This was his favorite part of the shift, even though it was the hardest work. The stage was huge, made of a special wood that was supposed to make the music sound better. There were rows of music stands still left out from the rehearsal. In the very center of it all sat the Steinway grand piano. It was a beautiful monster of an instrument. It was black and shiny, so polished that it looked like a dark mirror. Elias stopped his cart and looked at it. During the concert, he had watched from the back of the room, standing in the shadows by the exit doors. He had watched the famous pianist walk out in his tuxedo. He had watched the man sit down, lift the lid, and make the room come alive with sound. Elias sighed, a low sound that seemed to get lost in the high ceiling. He tightened his grip on the mop handle. He climbed the 3 carpeted steps up onto the stage. His boots thudded heavily, clumsy contrast to the grace usually associated with this platform. He started mopping the stage floor, back and forth. Swish, swish. The lemon scent filled the air. He worked his way around the music stands, being careful not to bump them. He worked his way toward the piano. The cleaner stopped just a few feet away from the piano bench. The lid was closed, hiding the keys. But the instrument still seemed to hum with a strange energy. Elias had always loved music. When he was a little boy, his family didn't have much money. They didn't have a radio for a long time, and they certainly didn't have a piano. But he remembered the sound of the church organ on Sundays. He remembered the way the music vibrated in his chest. He had promised himself back then that one day he would learn to play. But life has a way of getting in the way. There were jobs to work, bills to pay, and a family to feed. The dream of playing music had gotten buried under years of sweeping floors and fixing leaks. He looked around the hall. It was completely empty. The security guards were likely taking a break in the basement or watching the monitors at the front desk. They wouldn't come back here for another 20 minutes. Elias leaned the mop against a speaker stand. He wiped his sweaty hands on his pants. He looked at the piano bench. It looked like a throne waiting for a king who wasn't there. Just a look, he whispered to himself. His voice sounded small in the giant room. He stepped closer. He reached out a hand. His hand was rough, with calluses on the palms and dirt under the fingernails from a hard day's work, and he touched the smooth, cold wood of the piano. It felt nice. It felt solid. He sat down on the bench. It creaked under his weight. He felt a sudden rush of guilt, like a child who had been told not to touch the cookie jar. If the manager caught him, he would be fired on the spot. He stood up quickly, his heart beating fast. He looked at the exit doors at the back of the hall. They were closed. He looked at the dark wings of the stage where the actors stood. No one was there. It can't hurt, he thought. Just to see what it feels like. Sat back down. He took a deep breath. With a shaking hand, he reached out and slowly lifted the heavy lid of the piano. It groaned slightly, and then it was open. There they were, 88 black and white keys staring back at him, perfectly lined up. Elias stared at them. They looked so simple, just pieces of ivory and wood, but he knew they held magic. He looked at his hands again. They looked like the hands of a laborer, not an artist. They looked too big, too clumsy. He hesitated for a long time. The silence of the hall was heavy. It felt like the room was holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do. Finally, he raised his right hand. He hovered his fingers over the keys, not touching them yet, just remembering the position he had seen the famous pianist use earlier that night. He didn't know how to read music. He couldn't tell a treble clef from a bass clef. But he had a good ear. He remembered melodies. He remembered sounds. He pressed down a key. A clear, bright note rang out. So natural the sound seemed to jump off the piano and bounce around the walls of the concert hall. It was a loud sound in such a quiet place. Elias flinched, pulling his hand back as if he had touched a hot stove. He looked toward the door again, terrified that a security guard would come rushing in with a flashlight. But the door stayed closed. The note faded away into the darkness. Elias let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He smiled, just a little bit. That one note had sounded beautiful. It sounded better than anything he had heard in a long time. He felt a spark in his chest, a tiny feeling that he hadn't felt in decades. He put his hand back on the keys. He pressed another one, then another. He wasn't playing a song. He was just testing the water, like dipping a toe into a cold lake. He played a simple chord 3 notes at once. The sound was rich and full. It vibrated through the bench and into his legs. It felt like the piano was talking back to him. He closed his eyes. He tried to remember the tune the orchestra had played earlier. It was a slow, sad song. He moved his fingers, hunting for the right notes. He made mistakes. He hit a few wrong keys that sounded like clunky noises, but he didn't stop. He found the melody. It wasn't perfect. His timing was off, and his fingers were stiff. But the tune was there. He played a few bars, his hand moving slowly up the white keys. The music echoed in the empty hall. It wasn't the professional, polished sound of the concert earlier, but it had something else. It had a raw, simple honesty to it. For a moment, Elias wasn't a janitor. He wasn't an old man with aching knees. He was a conductor of his own feelings. The loneliness of the empty room, the weariness in his bones, and the hidden hope in his heart all seemed to flow out through his fingertips and into the strings of the piano. He stopped playing. The silence rushed back in, but it felt different now. It felt softer. Elias stared at the keys, his heart racing with a mix of fear and excitement. He knew he shouldn't be doing this. He knew he should get up, close the lid, and go back to mopping. But as he sat there in the dim light of the concert hall, looking at the black and white keys, he realized that he didn't want to leave. He wanted to stay. He wanted to understand this machine. He wanted to see if he could make it sing again. He looked around one last time to make sure he was truly alone. The coast was clear. He took another deep breath, cracked his knuckles, and placed both hands on the keyboard. He was ready to try again. The weeks that followed that first night became a blur of mop buckets and melody. What started as a moment of weakness, a foolish temptation to touch something he wasn't supposed to, slowly turned into the most important part of Elias's life. The Golden City Concert Hall was usually a chaotic place, filled with the noise of tuning instruments, shouting stagehands, and wealthy patrons complaining about their seats. But for Elias, the real life of the building happened when everyone else left. It became a ritual. Every Tuesday and Thursday night, the cleaning crew would finish their rounds in the lobby and the bathrooms. They would clock out and head to the diner down the street for coffee, but Elias would always find an excuse to stay behind. "I think I missed a spot near the stage," he would say, "or the floor needs a second coat of wax." His boss didn't care much, as long as the work got done. So he would wave his hand and let Elias stay. As soon as the heavy back doors clicked shut and the building fell into that heavy, waiting silence, Elias would drop the act. He didn't care about the dust anymore. He would park his yellow cart in the shadows backstage and walk onto the platform like a man walking into a church. He didn't turn on the big stage lights. Those were too bright and too obvious. Instead, he worked by the light of the emergency exit signs and the faint glow coming from the streetlights outside the high windows. It gave the hall a spooky bluish feeling, like being underwater. At first, Elias was terrible. He knew it, and the piano knew it too. His fingers were stiff and awkward. They were hands used to gripping wrenches and mops, hands that knew how to scrub hard, but didn't know how to be gentle. He would try to play the songs he heard the orchestra play, and it would sound like a child banging on a tin can. The notes were clumsy. He would lose his place, fumbling for the next key. His heart hammering in his chest every time, hit a discordant note that echoed too loudly, but he had something that many trained musicians didn't have. He had patience. And he had a deep, aching need to be heard. He didn't know how to read music. To him, the black dots on the paper sheets left on the music stands looked like ants crawling on a line. So he had to use his ears. He would hide in the back of the hall during the concerts, wearing his gray uniform, standing perfectly still against the wall while the audience cheered. He would close his eyes and listen. He wouldn't just hear the music. He would try to memorize it. He would listen to how the piano player's hands moved fast during the exciting parts and slow during the sad parts. He would hum the tunes under his breath while he swept the lobby floors later that night. When he sat down at the Steinway on those empty nights, he would try to find those tunes again. It was a struggle. It was like trying to remember a dream after waking up. He would play a note, shake his head, and try another. "No, that's too low," he would whisper to himself. That's not it. Slowly, night after night, the music started to take shape. His fingers, which were so rough and calloused, began to soften. The skin on his fingertips started to feel the vibrations of the strings in a way they never had before. He learned that if he pressed the key lightly, the sound was like a whisper, and if he pushed down hard, the piano would roar like a lion. One rainy Tuesday in November, Elias was trying to play a song he had heard a week ago. It was a complicated piece full of fast runs and jumps. He kept getting stuck on the same part, his left hand just not moving fast enough to catch up with his right hand. He stopped, frustrated, and rubbed his tired eyes. He felt the weight of his 60 years in his joints. "You're too old for this," a voice in his head seemed to say. "You're just a cleaner. Go home." Elias looked at his hands resting on the keys. They looked ugly to him. The knuckles were swollen, the nails were short and dirty from work. He thought about the famous pianists he saw on stage, with their smooth hands and their expensive rings. What was he doing? But then, he looked out into the darkness of the concert hall. He imagined the seats filled with people. He imagined his wife, who had passed away 5 years ago, sitting in the third row. She had always loved music. She used to hum old folk songs while she cooked dinner. "I'm doing this for you, Martha," he whispered very softly. He closed his eyes again. He didn't think about the notes on the paper. He didn't think about the techniques. He just thought about the feeling of the song. It was a song about saying goodbye. He let his hands go. He stopped trying to control every finger individually. Instead, he let the emotion guide him. Suddenly, the clumsiness vanished. His hands found the right notes, not because he memorized them, but because he felt them. The melody flowed out of the piano, rich and sad. It wasn't perfect. There were still timing issues, but the spirit of the music was there. It floated up to the high ceiling and filled the room. For 3 minutes, Elias wasn't a janitor. He was an artist. The music was pure and honest, coming straight from a heart that had seen a lot of hard times, but still had love to give. When he played the final chord, he let the ring fade away until the room was dead silent again. He sat there, breathing hard, sweat trickling down the side of his face. He felt a strange mix of exhaustion and electricity, like he had just run a mile. That night changed everything. Elias realized that he didn't need to read the dots. He just needed to listen. From then on, his progress sped up. He wasn't just mimicking the sounds anymore. He was making the piano his own. He would play the classical songs he heard at the shows, but sometimes he would mix in bits of old folk songs or tunes from the radio. He became a creature of the night. He learned the schedule of the security guards perfectly, knowing exactly when they would pass by the stage monitors so he could pause and look like he was sweeping. He became a master of stealth, a phantom pianist. The piano itself seemed to get used to him. The keys, which once felt cold and foreign, now felt like old friends. He knew which keys stuck a little bit in the humid weather and which ones had a brighter sound. He treated the instrument with a deep respect, wiping it down carefully with a soft cloth before he left, making sure not to leave a single fingerprint behind. Winter set in outside, and the city grew cold and gray. Inside the hall, however, Elias found a warmth that he had never expected. He looked forward to the long nights. He didn't mind the loneliness of the job anymore. The boredom of sweeping the same floors night after night was gone, replaced by a secret excitement. Every time he clocked in, he knew that at the end of the shift, he would get to visit his secret world. He was playing better and better each week. He was teaching his hands to do things he never thought they could do. He was playing fast scales and slow, deep chords. But still, he played only for the empty seats and the dust motes dancing in the dark. He believed that this was as good as it would ever get. He thought his music was a private secret, a small gift he gave to himself to survive the long nights. He had no idea that his secret was about to be discovered. He had no idea that the walls of the concert hall were not as empty as he thought they were. The winter had been harsh that year, biting the city with winds that rattled the old windows of the concert hall. Inside, however, the atmosphere was always controlled and perfect, kept warm by a heating system that hummed quietly day and night. It was a Tuesday night, just like any other, or so Elias thought. The famous orchestra was in town for a special week of performances. They were playing difficult, complicated music that people paid hundreds of dollars to hear. The maestro, a man named Victor, who was known all over the world for his temper and his perfect ear, had been leading rehearsals all day. Elias had watched from the sidelines, emptying trash cans and sweeping up candy wrappers. While the musicians practiced the same difficult passage over and over again, by 9 p.m., the rehearsal was over. The musicians packed up their expensive instruments in cases lined with red velvet. They chatted about dinner plans and complained about the cold weather as they walked out the stage door. Victor, the maestro, was the last to leave. He walked out with his coat collar turned up against the wind, carrying a leather bag under his arm. The building settled into its nightly routine. The security guards did their rounds, checking doors and signing clipboards. By 11 p.m., the hall was dark and silent. Save for the exit signs glowing green, Elias went about his work. He swept the lobby, he mopped the bathrooms, and he polished the brass railings until they shone like gold. But his mind was already on the stage. The orchestra had been playing a beautiful, slow piece during the rehearsal. It was a heavy, emotional song that had stuck in Elias's head all day. He couldn't wait to get to the piano to try and figure it out. He parked his cart in the usual spot and walked onto the stage. The huge Steinway sat there in the center, looking majestic in the dim light. Elias felt that familiar thrill in his chest. He sat down on the bench, lifted the lid, and cracked his knuckles. He started to play. At first, it was a little shaky. His cold hands needed a moment to warm up. He hunted for the notes of that sad song he had heard earlier. He found the melody, a low, mournful tune in the left hand, and added a gentle, weeping harmony with the right. As he played, he got lost in the music. He forgot he was sitting on a hard wooden bench. He forgot he was wearing a dirty uniform. He closed his eyes and let the sound take him away. He played the song with a deep, aching sadness, putting his own loneliness into the notes. He played for his late wife, for the years he spent working without being noticed, for the life he wished he had had. The music filled the hall. It wasn't the perfect technical sound of the orchestra. It was rougher, but it was raw and real. It sounded like a human heart beating. Meanwhile, outside on the snowy street, a black taxi cab had just pulled up to the curb. The back door opened, and Victor stepped out. He had made it all the way to his apartment across town before he realized he had left his scorebook on the music stand. It was a thick, black book with all his notes and markings for the next night's concert. Without it, the show would be a disaster. He paid the driver and hurried back toward the concert hall. The front doors were locked, but he had his special security key. He let himself in, shaking the snow off his coat. The lobby was dark and quiet. He walked quickly through the hallway, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. As he got closer to the auditorium, stopped. He heard something. Victor frowned. He checked his watch. It was almost midnight. The cleaning staff should have been gone by now, or at least they should be making noise with vacuums and carts. This wasn't the sound of a vacuum. It was the sound of music. He walked quietly to the heavy double doors that led into the hall. He pushed one open just a crack, just enough to peek inside. The stage was mostly dark, but there was a faint glow coming from the emergency lights. And there, sitting at the grand piano, was a silhouette. It wasn't one of the orchestra members. Victor knew their shapes and postures. This person was sitting hunched over, wearing a cap and a bulky jacket. Victor watched. He listened. He heard the piano playing the exact piece they had struggled with all day. The orchestra had played it perfectly, technically speaking, but Victor had felt they were missing something. They were playing the notes, but not the feeling. But this person, the person in the dark, was playing it. With so much feeling, it made Victor's chest tight. The music rose and fell like the ocean. The timing was a little unsteady, but the emotion was perfect. It was the most honest performance of the piece Victor had ever heard. He stood in the doorway, frozen. He didn't want to interrupt. He didn't want to scare whoever it was away. He leaned against the doorframe and closed his eyes, just listening. For 10 minutes, the hall was transformed. The fancy seats, the gilded ceilings, none of it mattered. There was just the music and the person playing it. Elias reached the end of the piece. He let the final chord hang in the air, fading into silence. He sat there for a moment, his hands resting on the keys, breathing in the quiet. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sound of slow applause. Elias jumped like he had been electrocuted. He spun around on the bench, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw a figure standing in the doorway at the back of the hall. He couldn't see the face clearly because of the light, but he knew someone was there. Panic flooded through him. This was it. He was going to be fired. He was going to be arrested for trespassing or damaging the piano. He stood up quickly, knocking the piano bench over with a loud crash. He didn't even stop to pick it up. He grabbed his cleaning rag and turned to run toward the side exit. No, wait. Please. The voice rang out through the hall. It was a strong, commanding voice, but it wasn't angry. Elias froze. He recognized that voice. He had heard it shouting directions at the musicians just that afternoon. It was the maestro. Victor walked down the center aisle toward the stage. As he got closer to the stage lights, Elias could see his face. He looked tired, and his hair was messy from the wind, but his eyes were wide open and bright. "Don't go," Victor said again. He walked up the steps, onto the stage. "You play beautifully." Elias stood there, clutching his rag like a shield. He felt small and embarrassed. He looked at his dirty boots, then up at the famous conductor. "I'm sorry, sir," Elias stammered. His voice shook. "I didn't mean to. I was just cleaning. I'll leave." "I'm sorry." Victor shook his head. He walked over to the piano and righted the bench. He looked at the keys, then back at Elias. "I left my scorebook," Victor said, gesturing to the stand where the book sat. "I came back to get it. If I hadn't forgotten it, I would have missed the best performance of the week." Elias blushed. "I'm not a musician, sir. I'm just the janitor." "I was just fooling around? I know I'm not supposed to touch it. Fooling around?" Victor laughed softly. "Nobody fools around like that. That Rachmaninoff piece? That is one of the hardest songs to play emotionally. You played it like you wrote it yourself." "I just play by ear," Elias mumbled. "I hear it and I try to find the notes. Victor looked at Elias with great interest. He looked at the man's rough hands, the weary face, and the cheap uniform. He saw a lifetime of hard work, but he also saw a spark that was very rare. "Do you know how to read music?" Victor asked. "Oh, sir. I don't know the notes, just the sounds." Victor nodded slowly. He walked over to the piano and sat down on the bench. He patted the empty space next to him. "Sit down, Elias," Victor said. He had seen the name on the man's uniform tag. Elias hesitated. He felt like he was in a dream, sir. "Sit," Victor commanded gently. Elias walked over and sat down. He felt uncomfortable sitting next to such a famous man. He felt like he didn't belong. "Play me the middle section again," Victor said. "The part where the music gets loud." "My hands are cold," Elias said nervously. "That's okay," Victor said. "Just play." Elias placed his hands on the keys. He was shaking so much he thought he might hit the wrong keys immediately. But Victor sat there, calm and waiting. Elias took a breath and started to play. The sound came out strong. Victor watched his hands closely. He saw that Elias had a strange technique. He used his hands almost like they were reaching for something. It's not stiff and formal like the conservatory players. It was unique. After a minute, Victor reached out and stopped Elias's hands gently. "You have a gift," Victor said seriously. He looked Elias in the eyes. "A gift like this doesn't come from a school. It comes from somewhere else. And it is a terrible waste to only let the walls hear it." Elias looked away. "People like me don't play pianos like this, sir. We clean the floors around them." Victor stood up. "Maybe that's true for most people. But tonight, the rules are going to change." The night air in the hallway felt very still after Victor spoke those words. Elias sat on the piano bench, his heart feeling like it was beating in his throat. He looked up at the famous conductor, then quickly looked back down at his worn-out work boots. He was waiting for the punchline. He was waiting for Victor to laugh and tell him to get back to mopping. But Victor didn't laugh. He stood there with his arms crossed, looking at Elias with a serious expression. The silence stretched out, heavy and thick. "I don't understand," Elias finally said. His voice sounded small and raspy. "I'm just a cleaner. I don't know anything about music. I can't even read the notes." "Knowing the notes is just learning the alphabet," Victor said firmly. "Music is the story. You have the story inside you, Elias. I heard it tonight. You play with a feeling that most musicians spend their whole lives trying to find." Victor walked over to a music stand and picked up the thick black book he had come back for. He flipped through the pages, looking at the complex symbols that looked like foreign ants to Elias. "Tomorrow night is the gala," Victor said, turning to face him again. "It is the biggest night of the year for this hall. The governor will be there. The critics will be there. It will be televised." Elias felt a wave of nausea. He didn't care about the gala. He just wanted to go home and hide under his blanket. "That sounds nice, sir. I'll make sure the stage is extra clean." "No," Victor said. "You are not going to clean the stage tomorrow night. At least, not for the whole show." Elias froze. "Sir, I want you to perform." The word hit Elias like a bucket of ice water. He stood up so fast, the bench scraped loudly against the wood floor. "No, absolutely not. You are crazy, sir. I can't do that. I will get up there and freeze. I will embarrass you. I will embarrass the orchestra. People will throw tomatoes at me." Victor smiled calmly. He had dealt with nervous musicians before, but never a nervous janitor. He reached out and put a hand on Elias's shoulder. The grip was surprisingly strong. "Nobody's going to throw tomatoes," Victor said. "You have been practicing here for months, haven't you?" Elias felt his face turn hot. You knew?" "I am the music director," Victor said. "I know everything that happens in this building. I have seen you on the security monitors. I saw you sitting in the shadows during the rehearsals, listening with your eyes closed. I didn't stop you because you looked like you were in a church, and I didn't want to disturb your prayer." Elias was shocked. He thought he had been so sneaky. All this time, the man in charge had been watching him. "Tomorrow, during the intermission," Victor continued, "the orchestra usually takes a break. I usually play a short filler piece, or sometimes we have a guest vocalist. But tomorrow, I want you to play. I don't have a tuxedo, Elias said, his last line of defense. We will find you one, Victor said. I have a spare in my office. It might need some alterations, but we will make it work. I can't, Elias whispered. He was terrified. The thought of sitting in front of thousands of people with bright lights shining in his face made his legs feel like jelly. You have to, Victor said softly. The world is full of people who play the right notes, but the world is starving for people who play with soul. If you don't share this, it is selfish, Elias, and I don't think you are a selfish man. Victor picked up his scorebook and started walking toward the door. He stopped at the edge of the stage and turned around. Be here at 7 p.m. tomorrow, he said, and don't wear your uniform. Then he was gone. Leaving Elias alone in the dark hall with the piano, the rest of the night passed in a blur for Elias. He finished his cleaning, but he felt like he was walking on clouds. He couldn't sleep when he got home. He sat in his small kitchen, drinking tea, looking at his rough, calloused hands. He thought about Victor's words. The world is starving for people who play with soul. All day Wednesday, Elias was a nervous wreck. He couldn't eat. He dropped his toast on the floor. He paced around his living room so much that his neighbor probably thought he was crazy. He almost called in sick. He almost packed a bag and ran to the bus station. But every time he tried to leave, he remembered the sound of the piano the night before. He remembered how it felt to play that one song. He was all alone in the hall. At 6:30 p.m., he arrived at the back entrance of the concert hall. He was wearing his best suit. It was an old gray suit he had bought 10 years ago for a funeral. It was a little tight in the shoulders, and the cuffs were frayed, but it was the best he had. He didn't wear his work boots. He wore a pair of scuffed black dress shoes. The security guard looked at him strangely when he walked in without his cleaning cart. I have a meeting, Elias said, trying to sound confident. He went backstage. It was chaos. People were running around with cables and instruments. The air smelled of hairspray and coffee. Elias tried to stay out of the way, hugging the wall. He felt like an imposter. He felt like he didn't belong. He found Victor's office door. He knocked lightly. Come in, Victor called out. Victor was standing there in his tuxedo, looking like a movie star. He looked Elias up and down. He saw the old gray suit and the frayed cuffs. He didn't look disappointed, though. He nodded. It fits well enough, Victor said. Sit down for the next 20 minutes. Victor didn't teach Elias how to play the piano. Victor knew Elias couldn't learn a new concerto in 20 minutes. Instead, he taught him how to walk on stage. Shoulders back, Victor said, correcting Elias's posture. Do not look at your feet. Look at the audience. They are not there to judge you. They are there to receive a gift from you. But what if I mess up? Elias asked, his hands shaking as he sat in the chair. Then you mess up, Victor said simply. You stop. You breathe. You start again. The music isn't about being perfect. It's about being true. Just play what you played last night. That is all I ask. Then came the moment Elias had been dreading. Victor took a garment bag from the closet and unzipped it. Inside was a black tuxedo. It was made of fine wool and looked incredibly expensive. Put this on, Victor said. Elias changed in the small bathroom. When he came out, he felt different. The tuxedo was a little big in the waist, but it fit him surprisingly well. He looked in the mirror. The old man with the sad eyes was gone. In his place was a dignified gentleman, someone who commanded respect. He straightened his bow tie and took a deep breath. Ready? Victor asked. I think I might throw up, Elias said. That is normal, Victor smiled. Come with me. They walked through the backstage maze. Elias could hear the murmur of the crowd outside. Thousands of people. He felt his knees shaking again. They reached the side of the stage, just behind the thick velvet curtain. The first half of the concert was about to end. Elias could hear the orchestra playing a loud, exciting finish. He peeked through a small gap in the curtain. The hall was packed. It looked like a sea of jewels and expensive suits. The lights were bright, making the dust motes dance. In the very front row, he saw the governor and his wife. He saw critics with their pens ready, looking bored. "I can't do it," Elias whispered, pulling back. "Look at them. They will eat me alive." Victor grabbed his arm firmly. "Elias, listen to me. For 30 years, you have cleaned this hall. You have picked up their trash. You have swept their dirt. Tonight, you do not serve them. Tonight, you lead them. You go out there and you show them what real music sounds like." The music on stage ended. The crowd erupted in applause. The sound was deafening, like a thunderstorm inside the building. "That is your cue," Victor said. "Good luck." Victor walked out onto the stage to conduct the applause. He bowed to the audience, then turned and walked off to the side. Elias was left standing there alone. He could see the piano sitting in the center of the spotlight. It looked lonely. It was waiting for him. The applause died down. The house lights dimmed even further. The announcer's voice boomed over the speakers, but Elias didn't hear the words. He just heard the blood rushing in his ears. He took one step forward, then another. He walked out of the shadows and into the bright light. The walk from the side of the stage to the piano bench was the longest journey Elias had ever taken in his life. It was only 20 steps, but it felt like walking across a tightrope over a deep canyon. The stage lights were blindingly bright, brighter than the sun, turning the darkness of the hall into a black void where thousands of people were hidden. He could feel the heat of the spotlights on his face, and he was terrified that if he looked down, he would trip over his own feet. He wasn't wearing his old work boots anymore. He was wearing tight black dress shoes that clicked sharply against the wooden floor. Click, click, click. The sound echoed through the entire building. To Elias, it sounded as loud as gunshots. He kept his head up, remembering what Victor had told him. Asterisk, shoulders back. Don't look at your feet. Asterisk, as he reached the center of the stage, he could see the piano waiting for him. It looked different now. In the dim light of his late-night shifts, it had looked like a friend, a confidant. Now, under the harsh glare of the concert lights, it looked like a judge. It sat there, shiny and perfect, waiting to see if he was worthy. He could hear the audience. At first, it was just a low hum of noise, like bees buzzing. But as the people realized that the famous maestro wasn't coming back out, and as they saw this older man in a slightly oversized tuxedo walking toward the instrument, the mood shifted. A ripple of whispers moved through the rows. Elias heard the sounds of confusion. He saw people in the front row leaning over to each other, talking. He saw a few critics pull their glasses down their noses to look at him. He knew what they were thinking. Asterisk, who is this man? Where is the star soloist? Is this a joke? Asterisk, Elias sat down on the bench. It squeaked slightly. The sound made him flinch. He felt small and alone on that giant stage. He looked out into the darkness, but he couldn't see faces anymore, just a wall of blackness. He took a deep breath, but his lungs felt tight. He reached out and lifted the lid of the piano. The heavy wood groaned softly as it went up. He rested his hands on the keys. His fingers were shaking. He was terrified that he would forget the music, that his hands would cramp up, or that he would just freeze and sit there in silence until they dragged him off. Then he remembered the night before. He remembered Victor standing in the doorway. He remembered the feeling of playing in the empty hall when nobody was watching. He remembered why he started doing this in the first place. He wasn't doing it to impress the people in the expensive clothes. He was doing it for the love of the sound, for the memory of his wife, for the years he spent in the shadows. He closed his eyes for a second. He imagined he was back in the dark hall, alone with his mop and his bucket. The fear began to drain away, placed by a calm focus. Elias pressed down on the keys. The first note rang out, clear and sharp. It cut through the whispers in the hall instantly. The buzzing stopped. Everyone went quiet. The silence was heavy and expectant. He began to play. It was the same piece he had practiced, the sad and beautiful song the orchestra had played earlier in the week. His left hand played the low, steady bass notes, and his right hand began to weave the melody. At first he played carefully. His fingers were still a little stiff, but as the song progressed, his confidence grew. The piano felt warm under his hands. He stopped thinking about the notes. He stopped thinking about the thousands of eyes staring at him. He just let the music flow. The sound was incredible. The acoustics of the Golden City Concert Hall were designed to catch every nuance, and the piano sang. Elias played with a deep, rich tone that came from his heart, not from a textbook. He played the gentle parts with a feather-light touch, and the loud parts with a force that made the piano vibrate against his chest. He wasn't perfect. There were moments when his timing was a little rushed, and a couple of notes were not as crisp as a professional pianist would play them. But nobody cared. The mistakes didn't sound like mistakes. They sounded like emotion. They sounded human. It was raw and honest. In the fourth row, a woman in a diamond necklace put her hand over her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. The music reminded her of something she hadn't thought of in years. A man in the balcony, a famous music critic who had heard every virtuoso in the world for 30 years, lowered his pen. He didn't write anything. He just closed his eyes and let the music wash over him. He realized he was hearing something rare, someone who played without ego. Someone who played with pure soul. Victor stood in the wings, just off stage, watching. He had a smile on his face. He saw the transformation. The janitor was gone. In his place was a master. The music was filling the hall, swirling up to the ceiling and down to the floor. Connecting everyone in the room, Elias reached the climax of the song. His hands were moving faster now, dancing over the keys. The music swelled, loud and powerful, like a storm crashing against a shore. The audience was completely spellbound. You could hear a pin drop. The usual coughing and shuffling that happens at concerts had completely stopped. Everyone was holding their breath. Then, Elias began to bring the volume down. The storm passed. The music became soft and gentle again, like the rain stopping. He played the final phrases slowly, savoring every note. He could feel the end coming. He played the last chord. It was a deep, resonant sound that hung in the air like a golden cloud. Elias held his hands on the keys, letting the sound vibrate, not wanting to let it go. He lifted his hands off the keys. The piano went silent. Elias sat there for a moment, staring at the black and white keys. His chest was heaving and sweat ran down the side of his face. He felt drained, but also incredibly alive. He was afraid to turn around. He was afraid that if he turned around, the silence would mean they hated it. But then it happened. A single person in the back row started clapping. It wasn't a polite clap. It was a loud, sharp clap. Suddenly, the entire hall erupted. It wasn't just applause. It was a roar. It started low, and then grew into a thunderous wave of sound. Hundreds of people jumped to their feet. The sound was deafening, louder than the orchestra, louder than the traffic. Whistles and cheers mixed with the clapping. Elias turned around on the bench, blinking in the bright lights. He couldn't see their faces clearly, but he could see the shapes of thousands of people standing up. He saw the white blur of their hands clapping. He stood up. His legs were shaky, but he managed to stand. He looked toward the wings and saw Victor walking onto the stage, clapping and smiling broadly. Victor put an arm around Elias's shoulder and guided him to the center of the stage. Elias didn't know what to do. He wasn't used to being the center of attention. He gave a small, awkward bow. The applause just got louder. They were clapping for him. Not the conductor, not the orchestra, but him. The man who swept the floors. He looked out into the crowd one last time. He felt a tear roll down his cheek. He realized that he wasn't invisible anymore. He had been heard. The secret song he had played in the dark for so long had finally found the light. He took Victor's hand and bowed again. Deeply. The roar of the crowd washed over him, a warm wave of acceptance. He knew that tomorrow he would have to go back to his uniform and his mop. He knew that life would go back to normal. But he also knew that he would never be the same. He had walked out of the shadows, and for one glorious night, he had made the world listen.